I'll just say I'm glad YouTube is working this time. So
Yeah, right, brother, man. Like that's. Did you play the lottery after that? Because like you like just to even for the universe to even out the karma of that, like you should have won something.
I mean, I do live in Vegas, so
there you go. Right? Yeah. Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Do we have a release date for that?
ASAP. I just have to watch the edited version.
Kelly, are those party lights in your area right there?
They are.
Nope. Just tell me they are.
Yes.
Dope.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's dope. No, I'm just kidding. What are they?
No, they're like those balls that are just like crepe paper kind of.
Oh yeah, right on.
But they look like party lights, but
that's right. That's right. It always makes it a party.
I felt like it made it.
Right? Sure. Right on. Right on.
You know.
And then Janet, that's just outside your window there.
Yes, Brian. This is coming from Florida. I just wanted to make you guys feel the warmth I have for you guys and the love.
Yeah.
And so I just felt it was important to kind of
make us a little jealous. Sure, I got you. I got you. What is it? What is it by you right now, Kelly? You guys getting the snow yet or no?
Oh yeah, we've got like 6 inches.
Yeah.
Outside, like it's dark outside.
Yeah. I love it. I love it. You were like, let me check the weather real quick. Yeah.
Yeah. No,
well, can I? Oh my gosh,
like
it's
2
8 o'clock,
today.
and we are so excited to get the Network and Learn kicked off today. Thank you guys for joining us. We know the attendees are coming in, so we'll give you some time. We are just excited to be here today and kick off 2021 with an Ask Me Anything with Bryan Dean. So we want to know what's on your mind. The chat box is open, Twitter is open. I'm so excited to be here tonight with our Network and Learn panel. We have Kelly Krupp, Matt Love, Sue Harden, Mackenzie Nichols, and ultimately we are having an opportunity to really sit down and have a talk, take a detour with Mr.
Nice.
Bryan Dean.
Nice. I appreciate that. Very nice. Very nice.
So
hello, everybody.
Mr. Bryan Dean is an instructional designer and the co-owner of DTour Professional Learning. Bryan has been working with hard-to-reach students, with emotional impairments, conduct disorders, behavioral difficulties, and low interest for more than 16 years. How many of you does that resonate with? Hold that thought. We want to hear your questions. Bryan has experience with designing professional learning around learner experience design, specially designed instruction, so close to my heart, Bryan, universal design for learning, new teacher induction, design thinking, deep learning, and strategies for students with emotional dysregulation. Oh my gosh, that is so relevant right now in the world we're living, but there's more. In addition to designing professional learning, he has designed virtual learning environments, worked on longitudinal system implementation and designed organizational, cultural, and climate change models, and developed a unique UDL coaching system based on appreciative and ontological coaching matrices. We are going to talk more about that, Bryan, because I want to know more about that. You guys join me and welcome Bryan Dean. Ask me anything.
Hey, that sounds actually, I don't like that. That sounds like a lot more than what I'm used to doing. So it's cool to hear. And I'm just going to be real transparent with everybody. 2 things. First, I got to give a shout out to Joni Degner out there. She's in the chat. Don't ask too many questions, Joni. I just want to tell you, it is strange to be on this side of things. I'm a little nervous, to be honest. I'm a little nervous.
Yes, Joni, we want to hear from you to help us dig deeper.
Come on.
Again, I want to take a moment to let you guys know, thank you guys for joining us. I know I have a quote from Bryan when he said to David Rose that he was a UDL zealot in 2016, and we're going to hear more about that. But we will be looking for your questions. And this is the time for you guys. We have some questions. We're going to get this conversation started, but we really want to hear from you. And you can also find us on Twitter. So we'll put more in the chat box for that. Bryan is passionate and he's got an amazing fashion sense. But our first question, Bryan, start us off with sharing your UDL path. When did you first learn about UDL? And how did you get where you are now?
Well, taking the second half of that is probably the easiest part. To be honest, I don't necessarily know exactly how I got to where I'm at. Like I'm fortunate to do the work that I do. And I am fortunate to work with some really cool people, and they give me a chance to just kind of sit around and think things up and say, how do we think around corners and how do we bring UDL to a bigger spotlight? So that's probably the easiest part. If I think about kind of where it started and where the whole thing began, I started in juvenile corrections, like teaching juvenile corrections, not like being in juvenile corrections. I mean, that's a different ask me anything, I suppose. But I started in juvenile corrections, and the interesting thing about working in juvenile corrections is there's a lot of things that we take for granted in a traditional school system, and not just about learners, but just in general about how systems and how delivery of systems kind of works that kind of get thrown out when you step into either alternative schools or you step into juvenile corrections. And one of those things is that kids are there for a year. And so I would have students that would come in, and I might have them for 3 weeks while they're in holding, or I might have them for 3 years, depending on whatever the sentencing may be or where they might be. So, you come in, you have these students who are non-traditional and have been marginalized most of their lives, and they've been kind of inundated with what they should be as opposed to what they are and who they are, and they haven't been given any voice as to who they are, and everything is based on this negative kind of facet, not just from the misdemeanors and crimes that they committed, but just from where they came from in life, and everything's been done to them, and they've never really been given any power. You start kind of deciding and thinking, what is it that I want, and who am I? And they've always been defined by the negatives. And so, you get those kids that come in and they've got these huge skill gaps. Kid might be able to do street math pretty quick, right? Like if you ask a kid to do fractions, they might not know how to do it on paper, but like if you give them the problem and you say, how many grams is an eighth, they know, right? But we take a look at that and we say that's not, that's not real learning, or that's not real knowledge. But that's exactly the knowledge that's needed. And without divulging too much of my own kind of past, like I had an affinity for those kids, and I had not more than an affinity. I knew where they came from. I grew up in Detroit, and I grew up in 2 neighborhoods in Detroit. If you're from Michigan, you understand those neighborhoods. I grew up in Howard Gardens complex, living over there in housing, and then I grew up in Biltmore, which is, it's a different neighborhood, and those are the 2 highest homicide neighborhoods in Detroit. And so I grew up there for a long time. And I got moved out to the country. My mom's moved us out to the country when I was real young. So, well, not real young, but when I was younger. So I had a chance to kind of move out of that system. But that system doesn't leave you, and that understanding of resource scarcity, and that understanding what it means to be not just hungry, but like you hungry, like you feel like your stomach's chewing on your backbone, kind of hungry. Growing up in that kind of system, or growing up in that kind of life, like it changes. Well, we know the research, right? But it changes who you are, right? So, getting back to it, like I started working with these kids in this system, and like I wanted to really form a community. The first thing I wanted to tell them was like, there are a couple things, like up until this time, people have done things to you, right? And there's no doubt that you have victimized others, but there's a reason why that victimization came to you. Like that's a learned trait. And so this is the first time I really want you to, like, I want you to be selfish in a good way. I want you to be selfish with your education. I want you to be selfish with your learning. I really want you to think about like what that means. And then how do we help others? The part I don't want you to be selfish with is how do we build community, and how do we all recognize where we come from, and that there's a lot of things that kind of unite us. And so I didn't know how to do that. And I didn't know how to bring together a bunch of different skill gaps, right? You got a kid that's, got a kid that's reading in third grade, you got a kid that can't read, you got a kid that actually is doing really well, like how do you got 15 kids and you got 22 different places that they're at. So how do you start to fill those? So I started trying to figure it out. And I stumbled across, in my beginning master's class, much like everybody else, I started to stumble across this idea of universal design. And I'm like, I'm going to be real honest. I thought it was kind of some academic BS, I was like, this, the way this is stated, the way that this is put together, like this seems like this is a bunch of people that are sitting building a framework, but I couldn't find anything else that made a lot of sense to me. And so I was like, well, maybe let me try this. Let me figure this out. If I have all these people, like the one thing that kept coming back to me was the idea of moving students to this expert learning. Like, how do I put them on this track to understand their expert learning? And then they're talking about this variability gig. And I'm like, wait a minute, they're talking about kids in the margins. I mean, like, my kids are some of the most marginalized kids I've seen. And then things started to fall into place. And then things started to make sense to me. And I was like, well, now when I look over this, like this language is academic, but like there's so many other far-reaching pieces that this really helps my students with. And it helped build our community in our classroom, and when people were looking out for each other, and when new folks would come in, like, some of the folks have been around for a while, some kids have been around for a while, they help them out. And I was like, this is really interesting, and they would say, this isn't like school. In fact, I used to get kids that would say, yo, this ain't no real school, Dean, and this is BS, and you're not a real teacher. And I'd be like, you damn straight. Like, you damn straight. And they don't think you're a real student. So let's use that power instead. Like you can call it an insult, but thank goodness I'm not a real teacher, right? Thank goodness this isn't a real school. I think because let's be honest, that hasn't worked for any of us. So we really started to be able to kind of form around that and think about that. And then I met a wonderful practitioner named Jane Strunk, and she was phenomenal. She had been working with Universal Design in Michigan, in Oakland schools, and she'd been working on the project called Project Stella, and that started to open my eyes up. And then she was a champion, and it was the first time that I had anybody champion me as an educator. So she championed what I was doing. That got exciting. And then I went to my first, I know this is going to sound like a cheesy plug, but I went to my first UDL-IRN summit. And it was the very first one at Johns Hopkins, and I was like, yo, this is my tribe. Like these people are, first of all, they're brilliant people, but they're dope. And I met like Jamie and Sue and Denise and David Rose and Grace, and Grace, and all these really dope people. And like, they were accessible. And that was the other thing that brought me in, is that everybody was accessible. You could sit down and have dinner. Right. In fact, I had dinner with David Rose, and I didn't know who the dude was. Not really. I mean, like I hadn't really met him, and I sat down and I was like, this dude's awesome. Like this, like he's like the best grandfather, seer, sage that I've ever met. And then it turns out it's David Rose. You know what I'm saying? So like all of a sudden that tight-knit community became something that I was like, I got to get more invested in this. And it just started to grow. I feel like I've been chatting a long time about this, but it just started to grow after that. Then I met, then I came in at this dope time where like all these other cool people were coming in, and some had been in the game and some were coming into the game. So like people like Joni were coming into the game, and then people like Katie had been in the game, and John had been in the game, and you start to see, and Louis at the beginning of the game, but they were all accessible, and you could see all these. I came in at this really cool transitional time. So there you go.
Isn't it amazing, like how diverse, right? and accepting, and when you think about how do you put this crazy group of people together that have that same passion?
Right.
And so what do you say to people who are just new and have questions?
I'm like, good. Glad you have questions, right? Because I'm glad they have questions from two avenues, right? If you got questions, it means you're hungry, and I think that's a great place to be. And the beauty of the UDL field, the UDL family, if you will, is that it should be accepting of those questions. And if you have questions, you'll probably have some questions that are critical. And we as a community, we as a group, we need to be able to have those critical questions face us. And if the system, if the framework, if it's as progressive as we say it is, and if it's as flexible in its means as we say it is, it should be able to welcome those criticisms. And so when people have questions, I'm like, ask them, and find people that you can ask those questions to, and find the people that they know, and then and just kind of be real honest about your questions. The beauty of the UDL community to me is that there's a lot of honesty in our practice.
And Bryan, that really resonates with me, especially in the last couple weeks, because that I welcome that different perspectives and bringing questions in, right? And making us think a different way, or think broader, or, oh my gosh, I never thought about that because that situation I haven't faced. So, kind of thinking about that, holy moly, it's a year. We've been in this pandemic.
Yeah.
How has the UDL movement changed, and what have we learned from that? What do we need to be thinking about? What do we need to keep in front of us, thinking about the students and how we're serving them?
Well, I think what's has been very interesting is that there's actually been a couple of things that have happened during this pandemic, right? And I think that this emphasis on remote learning and virtual landscapes and digital kind of environments and ecosystems has been big. But I think that the understanding, the bigger piece, one of the bigger pieces I walk away with is, how do you transition and how do you triage crisis? And then how do you move from that triage of crisis into stabilization? And I think that that's where UDL kind of is uniquely positioned. I think that, when it first hit, everybody was scrambling, like, I know from our end, we're trying to figure out how to do virtual events, which seem, I don't know, they seem maybe frivolous to a certain degree, but what we had built with the summit was a touch point for the community. And so we wanted to keep that, but we had to pivot pretty quickly. But we had to still maintain the essence of UDL. Now that is small, in all honesty, that is small in comparison to what teachers had to face, right? What educators that are working with students had to face. And so I think that what UDL was able to give was enough flexibility within the way that we build those environments physically. There's enough leeway within that system of UDL and that thought process of UDL, which I think is divergent thought in a great way. And I think that it's positive deviancy in a great way. And I think that it's thinking around corners in a great way, and put it to the practice of online. We can no longer just kind of give happenstance to the digital environment. We had to really think about it. And some people had already done that work. People like Kim Coy have been doing that work forever, and we were able to be like, but thank goodness we had people like that, But I think what it did is it put it on everybody's radar. And now we've moved out of that crisis to a certain degree, like we still have some residual of that crisis. And we are moving between that triage of the crisis into this point of like, how do we then use this to stabilize it? The beauty, if there's a beauty that comes out of the pandemic, is that certain things don't have to go back the way they were. And we can understand, now we can really look at our systems, and our systems say, great, those kids that were doing well and killing it in school, like face to face, they're suffering, they're dying on the vine, they're suffering at home. And so why is that? So then some people need that social construct, but some of those kids that were having a hard time, and they're only going to one class, they're skipping all their hours except for fourth hour because that one teacher gets it, or whatever it may be, right? That kid's doing well because that kid has a different way to regulate. So I think that we can't go back to the way that we were, and thank goodness we can't. Thank goodness we can't, because now we can work with more students. Absolutely. I'm sorry, go ahead, Janet.
It's interesting here in Florida. I'm in Florida, and we hear from teachers oh my gosh, I never knew that student could do it that way, right? And they were closed to multiple ways for students. And there's a really relevant question that's coming through the chat right now from Vina, who says, how does the UDL framework help us address the social emotional needs of learners? And honestly, Vina, thank you so much, because we got to take it to our educators too. This is, who here is not exhausted, but we're still passionate and we want to be there. So Bryan, what are your thoughts when it comes to that social emotional needs of learners?
Well, I think that just in broad strokes, to me, it has been very interesting in traditional school systems where we give all of this supposed power to teachers, or we give it like they're supposed to be in charge of it. It's not really that they have any power. It's that they're stuck in this position where they don't have true power to affect anything, but they have the responsibility of it. Right. Like when we say that, like oftentimes we feel that, as teachers and educators, we feel like we're in charge of learning. We're not in charge of learning. We never have been. Right. We're in charge of environments of learning. We're in charge of engagement and on-ramps to learning. But I can't make a kid learn. There's not a framework on this planet to make a kid learn. Right. And so like what this has exposed to us to a certain degree is that we need to start sharing some of that power. And to me, that's a huge part of the social emotional realm. Now, there are other pieces to that. Obviously, minimizing threats and distractions is stated directly in the guidelines. However, how we interpret that is pretty subjective sometimes. But I think that that's one of the large things, is that this is a system and a framework of system. I hate that, but this is a framework and a progressive one at that really allows us, gives intentionality to the intuition that we have as teachers. Right? Like I have not met a teacher, whether that teacher's been teaching for 40 years or that teacher's been teaching for a year and a half. Not met a teacher that's like, you know what? I got into this gig because I like messing with kids. Like I like messing with them emotionally, and I like putting them on blast, and I like them feeling like they're powerless. I haven't met those teachers. I've met teachers that have had some burnout, but I haven't met teachers that have said the reason I got into game education was because I really, really wanted to make the little kids. I didn't want to share anything with them. I wanted them to feel like they were dumb, right? So for me, I think what UDL starts to do is it says, how do we share that power? If I really want to move kids along a continuum, or students and learners, or help facilitate, not move them, but I want to help facilitate them along that continuum of expert learning, where they're self-regulating, where they find a passion, they're self-regulating, they can put goals and purpose to what they want to do, and they can achieve, and they can have a plan for achieving and self-actualize, then I have to look at that social emotional realm. And while I find that there are places within the framework where it's explicitly stated, I think that a lot of the pieces about the framework is about how do I manage the environment? How do I share power? And then how do I give full power over? Like those are the three stratifications in the UDL framework to me.
And Bryan, you've never, like, hearing it spoke that way, and it's more than a gradual release, right? Right. And that is scary for so many people in education, because you're learned like it's my job. So
right.
How did you, like, for the kids that were like, this is how we share the learning for students, right? This is how, but how do you tell that teacher that's a leap off a ledge? How do you tell them it's going to be okay?
Yeah, it's a leap of faith, and the fact of the matter is, at first, it's not going to be okay. I try to be very, very honest when I'm working with teachers. I say, here's the deal. At first, it's like therapy, right? Like you put in a work and it actually feels worse, right? It's like working out. You put in the work and you're like, 3 months later, I still don't look like The Rock. You know what I mean? Like it just hasn't happened for me, but then it clicks and then it happens. And to me, it's about what is the goal, and how do I like, what is the goal of my teaching? What's the intentionality of my intuition? Right? Like my intuition is I really want to help kids. I want them to feel empowered. And I know that if I know that the road is going to be bumpy towards that implementation, Like, I don't know how long it's going to be bumpy, but here are some of the hallmarks that I'm looking for. I'm looking for kids to start taking, like when they start voicing their concerns, their academic concerns, not just this lesson is BS, or I'm trying to watch my language because, I sometimes spout off. So,
No, that's because
so
that's
I don't know if we have a delay that you can beat, but like, when you get that kid that's like, they don't just say, excuse me, everybody, but they don't just say this lesson is BS. They go, this lesson is bullshit, right? Like when they have that much emphasis and power and passion in what they're saying, they're actually saying far more than that. When they start to articulate it towards as an academic thing, like I don't understand why I have to do it this way, right? Or why do I have to use this mathematical formula or whatever it is? I have to use this writing prompt. Like when they start to, that's how you know that you're starting on the pathway. And now it's our job to go from manager, right? We spend a lot of time in education being managers and dropping big piles of should on kids, right? Like we drop piles of should and they step in those piles of should. You should do this, you need to do this. We go from that position to a position of, let me understand why you're saying this. Now we're a facilitator. And we're not a facilitator just of learning, right? Because that's one of the cool things to say. We're a facilitator of how do I navigate and how do I find social currencies within a community. And that is massive. That's huge because that's the soft skills that they need when they get out of here. Those are the residuals of education.
And that's what we want, right? Lifelong learners, right?
Right.
Right. We're building so many opportunities to be more than what we could when we're shoulding.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And that's not for me. That's not me bagging on educators. Please don't believe that. Not. I mean, that's a systemic issue. That's a systems issue, right? Like I said, I haven't met teachers who just want to should kids. I've met teachers who are like, I'm responsible for their learning, but I know in my gut, in my intuition, that I'm not in charge of their learning. But I'm being told I'm responsible for it. That's a no-win situation for educators. But if we changed it and we said, you are really a designer of environments, whatever that might encompass, you're a designer of environments for kids to find learning, to empower them towards learning. All of a sudden, I can be in charge of that, right? I can be in charge of that.
So I'm glad you're talking about environments. So everybody's environment is a little bit different here. And so we have a question from out in the field, and Twitter, we want to hear from you. Audience, we want to hear from you.
Nothing too hard though, folks. Throw me some low ones.
Okay, you have a few pets, Brian. Can you talk about which pet is your favorite in your environment and why?
Oh. All right, so everybody, if you have heard before, and if you haven't heard before, I'm gonna drop it right here. We have an axolotl. My daughter she's got a heart like a giant's when it comes to animals. Like she's got this affinity. She can walk in, she's the animal whisperer. It doesn't matter what it is, the animal flocks to her. So we have a pug, we have a rescue pug, we have an axolotl, we have chameleons or had chameleons, we have a hedgehog. So out of all of those, probably the pug is my favorite, but they all have something special about them. Like the axolotl has to have perfect water temperature and perfect like water solution. So my daughter is testing it every 2 weeks. Our hedgehog, who is Eddie the Chap, has a limp and he's got a real bad attitude. And then my pug, she snores quite a bit and she is flatulent, y'all. Like she is so they all got their issues, but probably my pug is the one that she's always near me. She's like a shadow. So her name's Punky.
We won't tell the others. Okay, how about that?
I tell them all the time. I say, you're not my favorite. Oh. You're not.
Oh, that's awesome.
I say the same thing to my kids, so it's okay. Like no, I'm just playing. I'm playing everybody. I'm gonna get some hate.
There's just a comment I want to share with you. Love that the designer of environments for kids define learning that you talked about. And speaking of designing environments, what about animals in the classroom and animals on campuses, chickens, etc.?
Look, I mean, my general philosophy in life is get in where you fit in. You know what I mean? Like that's how I feel about everything. So if it works, it works. right? Like this idea of stodgy environments just doesn't happen. And if we really think about an environment is ultimately an ecosystem, right? It's an ecosystem of how people move through it, how they interact with it, and how they build it within the, like they build it as a community and as a people, and then furniture facilitates that, walls facilitate that. Then I say put whatever you can in there. If you can find a miniature Shetland pony that can walk the classrooms, do it. I mean, that's how I see it.
And that question came from Anna, who talks a lot about wanting to know more about outdoor learning environments, and how to remove some of the obstacles to learning. Here in Florida, that's definitely a possibility, but talking to Kelly earlier, who is getting covered in snow, and probably you, Sue, and Brian, I don't know how that works so good for you.
Yeah, so I did a stint as I'll tell you the title. I was a space futurist. Ooh, I don't exactly know what that means. But what I got to do was the job entailed kind of working within schools and helping design classrooms. Now we had another individual that worked in the South, and I will tell you, I'm from up here in Detroit, and like outdoor education is like the month of April. That's it. Maybe it's only half of it. Ultimately, before it gets too hot and humid outside, or it's just pretty cold. So we don't really do a ton of outdoor education. But what I think is really massive that I push for schools in northern climates to do is this idea of biophilia, right? And biophilic design. How do you bring elements of nature within a classroom or within a school? And that doesn't mean just potted plants. That means, how do we simulate grass within learning commons? How do we, pardon me, how do we build, biophilic walls of moss that if you see them in airports, or you see them in cool restaurants, or you can look at my environment behind me. How do you bring in those pieces so that the learning feels like a natural space? And I think I don't know how to remove the barriers for outdoor education. I have to think about it a little bit. But I think that by bringing it inside, at least up here, like it changes how we learn and the environment in which we learn, our reception of it.
What I love about the Network and Learn and the UDL community as a whole is that, guess what? We get to continue those conversations as we learn more and think about it more, and people bring in their perspectives. There's another question that's in the Q&A that says, Brian, can you talk about the differences between accessibility and UDL?
Yeah, I think that this is always a constant question. Is one fits inside another, right? So I think that accessibility is, in my opinion, accessibility is how do we get people to the environment? How do we get them at the, how do we change that environment so that everybody can get on it? But UDL is more about how do we change the frame of that environment? How do we say that the environment is the thing that's malleable, is the thing that we can change, it's the thing that we can fix? I feel as though sometimes accessibility, especially, I think it's changing because we're starting to think about accessibility far more from products that we use to what we see. So it's a design element from the beginning. But I think for a long time, and actually, Janet, you probably have a better thought on this than I do, but I think that accessibility for a long time was a retrofit. It was something that we did afterwards. And so UDL was not a retrofit. UDL's brought to the forefront this idea of how do you design ahead of time, and how do you can't design everything, right? But you can design large pieces. And how do you design those so that they're more inclusive? But ultimately, I think that we're starting to see a shift in that in accessibility, is that now accessibility is more about how do we design from the beginning for inclusivity.
You're absolutely right. I've waited for 30 years to say, holy moly, the market model has it, like, it's so many opportunities. And so it definitely, so many things are built in, and it became personal for so many of these companies, which is great. That's what we needed, right?
Yeah.
We're fighting over there. And so accessibility in UDL, it's perfect, right? Because it does, now we can say all.
And I don't think that it used to be that way, Janet. I don't know that it used to be. I think that they were spoken of much like the question asked, like, what's the difference between the two? I think that thankfully we are moving more towards a system where we say that inclusivity is what we want. And so that UDL and accessibility start working hand in hand, and then lines become blurred. But I think before that, it was accessibility was done to something and said, here are your limited options. And UDL said, well, you shouldn't have limited options. And those two were at war. You know, they were at conflict with each other a little bit in our minds, but not really in philosophy.
No, and that's why it made it, it just made it just so perfect. And it's exciting as we move forward, because like barriers are being removed, right? In a way with COVID, barriers are being removed because so much technology tools are like, oh my gosh, I didn't know what they knew. And we have to use them now.
Yeah. Yeah. And barriers are being exposed, you know, on so many different levels, you know, but barriers are being exposed. And I think that that's like, we have to be honest about that. And, you know, we have to take our lumps where that is in education, in society, and whatever else. And we have to say there's a better way to do that. There's a better way to figure those things out and design for them.
And not only designing, but coaching. And that leads me to Bryan, something that what you have developed and I want to hear more about is your unique UDL coaching system based on appreciative and ontological coaching matrices. Tell us more about that.
It sounds way cooler than probably what it boils down to in practice. But like the thumbnail of it was, so taking what I had learned kind of from juvenile corrections, I moved out into, they closed down my facility, which happens a lot in alternative education and in institutional education, quote unquote. So they closed down my facility and they threw me into a school, like a quote unquote normal high school, which was a mind, it was a mind shifter for sure. And then from there, I taught for a little while, and then I moved into a coaching scenario in more of a district, like a district-wide piece, and I didn't want to approach coaching the same way that I had seen it before. I wanted to approach it from the idea of practice and design, and that there were certain things that we knew were pieces of pedagogy, right? And that they weren't necessarily pieces of English or ELA or numeracy or math, you know, whatever. It weren't just pieces of that, they were pieces of pedagogy. And so I wanted to find a way for us to figure out what a quality instructional coaching would look like. But I was not happy with coaching systems that had kind of existed, because they were always targeted at deficit again, right? It's always deficit-based coaching. And I mean, it's not that way anymore. But like, you know, this is in a time where Jim Knight's work is just starting to become something. He's just starting to formulate those pieces. And so at that time, coaching was the coaching model was, you screwed up, right? We can't fire you yet, right? We're going to send somebody in. We're going to send a goon squad in to tell you what you're doing wrong. And if you continue to do it wrong in a year and a half, 2 years, while you're making it hard for kids to find their way in school, we're going to let you go, right? Like that was the coaching model. And I was like, that don't get it. You know what I mean? Like that doesn't seem to fit. So I wanted to find a way that we could find positions to match. And so that's kind of like the ontology piece of it is, how do you find positions and postures that match the behavior of the coach, right? So or match the behavior of the person that you're coaching with, right? And so if Janet, you're standoffish, right? Like how do I match that position very openly, right? And how do I then work with that? Or if we engage in this thing at that time, you know, people were engaging a lot in educational cockroaching, and that's what I call it. And this is why I call it that. That's, you know, when you flip on the lights, what happens? And you got a bunch of roaches. What happens? Everybody scurries. Everything scurries, right? And so that's what was happening with people's practice. You flip on the light and spotlight somebody's practice, and everybody scurry, and they try to find a way to hide. And I wanted to find a way not to do that, to have us flip on the light and be like, these are amazing things that are happening. And so the appreciative side of it was, where are you at and how do we build something together? And how and what is it that you're looking to build? And then the ontological side of it was more about like, what's the position that I take behaviorally to help you feel like your practice should be open, and that you should, like, we shouldn't do that teaching of egg cartoning, right? Like, where like if you open up a set of an egg carton and you see the eggs in there, they all look like they're touching. But if you look underneath it, they're all in separate places, aren't they? And that's what I was yeah.
Right?
Yeah, but like they were all separate, but they weren't, but they looked like they were together on the top. And I said, that's not real, right? Like that's not really being together. That's superficial togetherness. And then like that leads to toxic cultures and toxic climates within schools, where people throwing each other under the bus for their practices, just so that they didn't get thrown under the bus. And that's survival. That's not thriving, that's surviving. And so I wanted to find positions that looked at behavior and said, if you're closed, how do I notice that? And then what words do I use? What stances do I use to help bring apart, open you up, so that then we can talk about the things that are really great that's going on in your practice. And then how do we come together on a plan and an approach to that? And there's lots of things that do that now. There's lots of different coaching systems that do that now, but it was one that we had started.
And you just, even like my initial like, oh wait, but really I wasn't looking at that total exposure, right?
Yeah.
And so I think we have to be critical, even in our I'm thinking, oh, but it's supported, but no, like seriously, if we each of us take a critical look and take a moment to step back and say, wow, this is a place that we can improve our practice. So thank you, and I want to hear more about that. To follow up with that, what would, knowing about, what you just talked about, what would a question came in on the chat, what would a UDL 101 training look like for faculty who know nothing about UDL? And how do we take it deeper, right? How do we keep them coming back? Like, and this is my passion, right? How do we keep people coming back beyond 101, thinking they know it? Because we have to have an ongoing growth model. Like I think I always want to be a learner. Like there's no end, right? Because there's always a student that brings us something different.
I think that UDL in many ways is kind of like is like a national dish in any country, right? Like there's the national dish that everybody cooks differently, but everybody knows how to make it. Or like your family dish, like if everybody knows the family sauce, but everybody makes it different, or whatever it is, right? I think that UDL 101s are a lot like that. But for me, the beginnings of those, I don't talk about UDL in the beginning. I want to talk about like where we're at as practitioners. Right? Like, so what are our beliefs about learning, right? So what are the assumptions we make? What are the assumptions we have about learning? What are the things that we put forward about that? And what assumptions do we make about learners? And what assumptions do we make about being an educator? And then what are our intuitions about what's good to do as teaching? Because every teacher, some people balk at that idea of when teachers say, well, UDL is just good teaching. If that's where you're at, I'm fine with it. That's dope for me then, because that means that you are putting UDL in a spotlight of good teaching practices. Now, that means that intuition wise, like in your gut of your teaching, you feel like this is the right thing. So from that, then the framework, as you start to introduce the philosophies of UDL and then the framework of UDL, what you're really doing is you're really kind of like bolstering their intuition. And you're saying, here's the reason why that you feel that intuitively, right? And this is why you say it's good teaching. Here's the stuff that backs it up. And now we're at a place where I feel as a person in the 101, I feel like I'm doing something right, instead of here comes another thing, right? Like this is stuff that kind of like, it re-energizes me. It gets me jacked. This is what I love, right? I'm vibing this really, really, like I'm vibing this system and I'm vibing it hard. And then we say, well, great, now that we're in this position, we all have room for improvement and reflection, and educate, being an educator is ultimately, it's part science and it's part art. And the part of the art is being reflective, right? And understanding that your classrooms, that you're an artist to a certain degree, and that your classrooms are artisan classrooms. They're small batches that have imperfections and things to figure out. And that's the beauty of them, right? And so now I have to be critical of my own practice, but I'm in a much better place to be critical of my own practice because I know the things I'm doing well. That's how I started UDL 101.
And so did I. And I think that's why it's so inclusive, right?
Yeah.
Because one small step for any educator, like, right, we meet them where they are, right? And help them start their journey.
And we meet ourselves. We meet ourselves where we're at. Like, that's the other side of it. Like, we always really want to focus as educators on where do I meet my kids at? But the fact of the matter is, we got to meet ourselves too, right? I don't mean to cut you off there, Janet. I'm sorry.
No. You're absolutely, and thank you, because that's so true. Because it takes growth in both areas, right? Us as educators and the students we support. Okay, they want to know, Bryan. They want to know, what was your inspiration for your funky and fun wardrobe? Like,
I guess got to try and find things that fit. No, I mean, to be completely honest, like, you know, I'm on the larger side, right? Like, I'm a 6'4" bearded dude with tattoos. Like, there's no place where I'm gonna blend in. So, like, part of me is like, if I'm not gonna blend in anyways, I might as well show up to show out. You know what I mean? So, like, that was part of it, and I think that part of it comes from, you know, all the coolest cats I used to see back on the block. Like, they had color and they had flair and they had flash, and I wanted to find that. You know, so I think that was a big part of it. And so I want to bring that 70s hip vibe to a modern day look, I suppose. And then I lost all my hair, so I gotta be bald.
You wear it well, right?
Well, thank you.
And I think it just tells us something, like how we can all, right? It's UDL is feeling comfortable on who we are too, right?
Yeah.
Like you don't have to fit to anything. Like, be who you are, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think, you know, so Joni once told me, like, Joni Dagner and I were chatting. You know, Joni's my partner in a lot of things. She's my partner just kind of in life. She's my partner in life, and then she's my partner professionally. And she's, you know, one of the brilliant things she said is that, you know, you gotta show up as yourself.
Mhm.
Like, you can't show up any other way because it's gonna come through anyways.
Yeah.
And so I think that's very true of not only our teaching practice, our coaching practice, all those things. It's also true of how I present. I try to present a very, very much Bryan way, you know, and how I dress, I guess.
No, and it's authentic, and
Yeah.
it's why we trust you and we believe you. And I think that's good, right? And that's what I love about the UDL community. You know, we don't have to meet, right? Because
Yeah.
our students don't meet, our education systems don't meet, right? They are diverse.
Yeah.
And
it's
so
beautiful.
thank you.
Yeah, no, yeah, for sure.
So Bryan,
Yeah.
you know, we talk a lot about how can, from a higher, take a step to higher ed, right? Because we know higher ed, not only, those are the kids that made it through, right? That we hope the kids that we supported can make it through, but also influencing those educators that are going to come back and support the students. Like, right, it's that circle of life,
Mhm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And we hope more and more students make it, right, to that higher ed opportunity. What do you say to open up lines of communication on what they can do, where to start, why they should take that next step? Think about UDL practices.
Well, you know, I mean, higher ed is sometimes it's sometimes a different beast, right? But I think that one of the big pieces that always sticks with me is this idea of bounded autonomy. And we spend, you know, like, one of the biggest things I hear all the time, you know, like, I got a top 5 or top 10 of criticisms of UDL, and one of the biggest is like, yo, I can't give them choice all the time. Well, I think you can, but I think what you're really saying is I can't give them choice over everything all the time, and you shouldn't. right? Like you shouldn't do that in first grade, and you shouldn't do that in the sophomore year of college. There's no reason to give choice over every aspect. And so bounded autonomy is this idea that like I can give you freedom about certain things, but there's certain things that just are the way that they are, right? Like I got a house and I can take all of the inside walls out except for a couple, right? I can't take out the middle wall, and I can't take out the walls that go to the outside. I can't do it. And you can be mad about that all you want, but the fact remains that structure is that structure. And so I think that bounded autonomy actually gives us, as instructors and educators, gives us some shared power, right? So this idea of like, I may not be able to give you autonomy over the task at hand, or I may not be able to give you autonomy over the technique by which we do it in this case, but I might be able to give you autonomy over who you work with, your team, or I might be able to give you autonomy over the time that it takes to do it, or the space or turf that I do it on. Like, and then maybe I can give you in the next assignment, maybe we can talk about the compromise of time over technique, because it's not needed. I like, if I'm writing a paper, that the subject matter, the task, I can't change maybe, but like how you write that paper, write it any way you want. Write it on Post-it notes, whatever the technique is, because I have to hold tight to the task. And I think that in higher ed, there's a concern. Now I'm not a higher ed person, but I think that there's a concern over like, I have to give them everything. That's ridiculous. And that's not real life. And I say, hell yeah, you're right. It's not real life, right? I still got things I got to do at work. Like I got a cool job, but I still got stuff I got to do that I got no control over. Right. And they just say, yo, that's what needs to get done, Brian. And so I got to do it. So really in higher ed, it's also, it's not just about what do kids want to learn, or what do students want to learn, learners want to learn, right? It's also about like, what are the resources and how do I use those resources to benefit? And like, what is it that I need to work on? Now we're moving into the reflection part, self-regulation part. That's what I think with the higher ed. Matt, how does that sound?
Come on, Matt.
As the higher ed person, it sounds great to me.
All right, cool, brother. Okay, good. I just want to check in with the people,
No, and you're absolutely right, because guess what? Now, right, there's so many misconceptions, or like that's a cop-out, right? But not just a cop-out, not completely a cop-out, but wait a minute. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We have so much room to support students.
Well, it's not a pendulum swing, it's a continuum.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that we've been enculturated to think that things that come through education, whether they be in higher ed or they be in, secondary or primary, that they're a pendulum swing. It's either all or nothing. And I've met very few things in life that have been all or nothing, education included. And so I think that we need to think about that. And we need to hold that in our thoughts as we design things,
And so when I think about my shift in thinking, and you're still even making my shift in thinking move even more tonight. So I want to thank you, Brian, because even that is just like, oh, you're absolutely right. I believe that. I thought about it, but when you're faced with those questions from the folks you're supporting, sometimes you're like, oh, wait. So I'm going to listen to this recording many times over again and have conversations. Hey, let's talk about this. But clearly you have made leaps and bounds and shifts in your thinking and how that changes your work. When someone's new to this, how do they like take it in, and where do they start, and how have those shifts helped you continue to grow, right? 10 years in and you're still growing. Talk to us about that as we wrap up.
I appreciate that. I think that, Joy Zabala once said to me, we were presenting at this place, and Joy Zabala, like, if you don't know who she is, you got to look her up. Because she's in many ways, I think that, she's a pioneer in so many pieces around accessibility, but also around what UDL at its core is about. But we're sitting outside this hotel, and she said this thing to me, man. It summed everything up. It's like one of those epiphany moments, and I've probably said it a million times. But you can't boil the ocean, right? You can't boil the ocean. So you can't just like you can, but you can boil a pot at a time, right? You can boil one thing at a time. And so for me, UDL is, if it's truly a practice, it's truly a journey, it's truly about self-discovery as well as discovery and reflection in your practice, then don't worry about getting the whole ocean done. Right? Like teachers, I gotta be honest, man, teachers are go-getters. Educators in general are go-getters, right? They are powerhouses of individuals. But the drawback of that is that we want to do everything because we're used to doing everything, right? Like we're used to figuring it all out on our own. But with UDL, it's about fluidity, and it's also about rigidity, right? Like you have to hold yourself to this idea that I'm going to work on one piece of this practice. And that might be, how do I figure out choice? And maybe it's not within the guidelines themselves, but maybe it is a guideline. Maybe you say to yourself, I really want to figure out this thing about minimizing threats and distractions. And what is my part in creating those threats and distractions? Am I part of that? Do I make sure that I do that by removing those? Am I limiting my students? Like those are big questions, but that's one place, that's one pot to boil. Or you might say, I really want to work on this idea of engagement. How do I build on-ramps in my environment for students to really get into their learning, to really tuck into it and really get to the meaty parts of it? Like, how do I do that? That's one pot to boil. So I say, find your pot, start boiling your pot. And then when that pot feels like it's boiling, go get another one.
You know, and that takes, and we have to have partners that help boil the pots, right?
For sure. Yeah, you get a group of educators together. Like there's a saying that I use all the time. It's like, you got to get you a poop in a group like a fourth grade teacher, right? And like, I mean, like, I think that's all educators. I would say you need to get your poop in a group like a 10th grade teacher, like a first grade teacher, because that's what happens. And if you get a group of individuals together around that mindset of like, we're boiling our thing and we're working on it and we're sharing in a real community of practice, in a real, in a real group, we could, those are the individuals that change the entire system because they're dedicated to doing it.
Wow. I don't know about you guys. I am just like, yes, Joni says only Bryan can get away with saying poop in a group at a network and learn. And we all get it, right? It just resonates. It resonates that that's the work, right? And we appreciate that transparency that you bring to the table. So we have 5 minutes, and anything from Twitter. And somebody tweeted that, so it's right with you. So Bryan, that's great, because guess what? They're going to come back. They're going to say, I want to come and watch this network and learn recording and hear what the hats, tats, and UDL Bryan Dean that exemplifies a detour, right? To take a new perspective and look at UDL and design learning for students. So Bryan, we have about 4 minutes, and what do you say to somebody new saying, what is this guy talking about? And then some of the other people that are just tired. I think in this pandemic, so many people are tired. Like, how do we, I know I am reinvigorated and just so excited to have this opportunity to get to be able to be the one that kind of asks those questions to Bryan Dean, turn the tables on you.
I know it makes me a bit nervous, but this has been a good experience. For those people, I say, like I said before, I've never met a teacher that's lost their flame. I've met teachers that have had them under embers. I've met teachers but there's never been kids that have done that, right? It's always been systems, and we need to be very, very conscious of that. And so if you are just getting into this, what's your passion? And one of the first things that educators always say is they say, my passion is kids. I'm like, yo, that's dope. I understand that. That's why we're all here. But that's like a rock star saying I like music. Of course they do. But there are other things that they like. right? And so what's your professional passion and how do you find it? There's a great routine out there that's called passion profiles. I suggest that people go and find it because there's like 9 different passions that it goes through. And the first one you pick is usually like the child is one of the passions. And you're right, it's got to be. However, there are a bunch of other professional passions. So your professional passion helps you with that. Strong reflection on your work and your practice, I think helps you with that. Finding your people. And I know that we put lots of fluffy things around it, but really, find your crew that you can work with that have the same philosophies and ideas you do. Find your tribe, find your community of practice, find your whatever you want to call it. Those are your people, right? And they hold the same things. I don't know if you can hear my dog snoring in the background. I'm so sorry, everybody. But you've got to find your tribe. And I think that the UDL tribe is a good tribe because it's a big tribe, but it's a big tribe that feels very small. You can find just, you want to reach out, you want to chat some more, just hit me up or hit up Kelly Culp or hit up, Janet Good. I just put all of you on blast, or Matt, but reach out, come to, I've always said that something like the summit, like a big gathering of the summit is like coming back to UDL summer camp. You know what I mean? And that's the vibe that we have tried to keep because it's important and we get a lot of things out of it. It's the concept of hard fun, right? Like where you walk away and you're exhausted, but you're like, I'll do it again. Just give me a minute. Let me get a glass of water and I'm back at it. That's a passionate group of people. And those are the people that reinvigorate you. We gotta find our people to charge with and chill with.
And you know what, Bryan, for those who are like, oh my gosh, I don't know that group. You know what? Come as you are, right? Be you, come as you are, because you are welcome. And it is a safe place. It's the most welcoming place, right? And I got to say that my first UDL summit was up in Townsend. And I was like a little energized bunny. Like I was just so excited and to meet new people who take that risk. If you're going to take a step, you're welcome to have a conversation with anybody here. And we're so glad you could be part of this Ask Me Anything with Bryan Dean, taking a detour, our first Ask Me Anything of 2021, making, this year better, right? Share this recording. It will be posted on the site. If you haven't heard about the summit coming up, more information will be coming your way. It has been an absolute pleasure. Bryan Dean, the Hats, Tats, and UDL Master. Thank you so much for having a conversation with me tonight.
I appreciate it. Thank you. And thank you for making it painless. I was straight nervous, but it's the fam. So I appreciate it.